Hello, I'm Suzanne.
And I'm Zoe.
And you are listening to Sex Advice for Seniors. And this week, I'm turning it over to Zoe mainly because we are going to talk about something that we probably should have discussed 100 years ago when we first started doing this, which is what it feels like, which is, what do you do for a living, Zoe, the sexologist? What does that actually mean? I'm curious to know because I've never been to a sexologist. As you know, I have no formal training other than having slept with thousands of people.
That's the best training you can get.
No, I'm just joking. It's probably not thousands. It's probably a few hundred. But anyway, it doesn't. Numbers don't count after a certain amount of time. I understand. Anyway, if there's 10 in a room, you don't count them all. So yeah, enough of that.
So as a sexologist, I help people have their best sex lives. I mean, essentially, and to understand their bodies and their minds and how they're connected in the realm of sexuality and sexual expression and pleasure in the body. And so that can take a lot of different forms, from writing a book and having a podcast and answering a lot of questions and going into Reddit and doing AMAs and writing articles in magazines and all those sorts of things. And then in addition to that, I have a private practice in which I am a sex and intimacy coach. So that is really the sort of bulk of what I do in terms of really getting in there and doing some deep work with individuals and couples together. And so, what does a sex coach do then? A sex coach is, I have a lot of people that come to me with very specific problems, such as I'm having trouble maintaining an erection, or I'm having trouble holding back ejaculation, or I am having trouble, lubricating. I'm a woman with a vulva and I'm having trouble lubricating, or I have no sex desire for sex. I have zero libido, or my partner and I want a different amount of sex. How do we meet in the middle? I also have a lot of people who are coming back from trauma of some sort. There's a lot of in the United States anyway. There's a lot of sort of religious shame around, or family of origin shame around sex and sexuality. We have a phenomenon in this country called purity culture, which is sort of like in the evangelical Christian communities, where there's a lot of very, in some of the more, sort of traditional Christian churches and sects, there's a little bit of a, not so much an overt, explicit shaming of sexuality. That exists, but it's much more of a passive thing. But in purity culture, there's a lot of very clear articulation about sex and ideas that really end up causing residual harm, So I do a lot of unwinding that. There are people who are dealing with kinks, or, what we call issues with their arousal template. That's a clinical term, for things that turn you on and things that people find a little bit problematic. I mentioned on a recent episode, I have a client who needed to have stinky gym shoes near him, and so, which wasn't a problem for him or his partner. So good for them. But there are people who have things that they would like to sort of unwind and get past and find a different experience of, So there's a huge range of work that I do with clients to cultivate a really healthy, nourishing sex life. And some of it exists mostly between the ears. Some of it exists in the body, and some of it exists in the sort of relationship between those two things. Um,
And is this mainly online, or do you meet them in an office, or like what's the setting for
yeah,
these sessions?
it's a great question. I coach people all over the world through technology, through the gift
Yeah.
of laptops with Zoom on it. And that actually predates the pandemic.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, I have been for a very long time. It used to be Skype,
Yeah.
when I don't know in the UK or Europe if people are still using Skype, but here in the States, it's almost exclusively Zoom that's being
Yeah.
used. So yeah, it's totally confidential. You just sort of show up for the sessions. It looks on the outside looking in, it looks very much like therapy, like a therapist,
Yeah.
an hour a week with a lot of homework in between.
Oh. And I think, I mean, the only time I went to, actually twice, I went to see somebody twice, two different people, when I felt very stuck in my head around certain imagery and fantasies that were preventing me from being intimate with people. Like I just got into a loop in my head, and if I couldn't, and I couldn't really, achieve an orgasm without being in that little loop. And people started to notice that I wasn't really present,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um,
super common.
and so I actually ended up going for hypnotherapy for that, which was quite a traumatic experience, to be really honest. But it did work. But it was I sort of ended up. It wasn't really like a panic attack, but I ended up, my whole nervous system kind of activated, and I started shaking from top to bottom, and I couldn't stop it, and it was quite scary.
Wow, wow.
And yeah, it was like this kind of trauma was trying to get out. Do you use any techniques like that, or is it purely just talking therapy?
Yeah, it is. I do a lot of somatic practices, so
Yeah.
not necessarily hypnotherapy or EMDR as a trauma treatment
Yeah,
modality.
yeah. I did EMDR as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, uh, no, and I've referred out to therapists who sort of specialize in that kind of thing. But I am an integrative somatic trauma therapist certified, and I do have a lot of sort of techniques for working for guiding individuals to work with their own nervous systems.
Yeah.
So I will often guide in a session, I will often guide a sort of a somatic exercise, which can look like a number of different things. Sometimes it's just closing your eyes and letting me guide you into your body and talking about, what you're experiencing and what the sensations are. And then we, can move energy around to
Mhm.
help to clear the pathways and clear the mind, basically.
Yeah.
Um, and ultimately regulate the nervous system. So a lot of people, will come to me and say, I can't get out of my head and into my body during
Yeah.
sex. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so then there's a whole sort of set of techniques and tools and skills that I've developed as sort of this package of, um, a treatment protocol, sort of, if you will,
Yeah.
to cultivate those connections outside of the bedroom and learn to work with your own nervous system and sort of wrangle your thoughts so that you can, once you're in the bedroom, in bed, having sex, either solo sex or partnered sex,
Yeah.
you can be present with your body and what your body is experiencing without spinning out into anxiety.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then there's a whole other piece of the work that I do that involves couples and
Yeah.
working with a couple together. And one of the things that I love most about my work with couples is um, a sort of a different format, which are intensives, like in-person intensives. And that's a really special sort of process that we go through together, the three of us. And I structure it with several sort of Zoom sessions that with each individual partner and the couple together. There are worksheets and sort of exercises to do together that all culminate in a 3, 5, or 7 day in-person intensive where I either fly to them or they fly out here. I'm in Los Angeles, California. Lovely place to be. Or
Yeah.
we meet in the middle, or we meet somewhere lovely. I met a couple one time in Napa Valley and also one in Mexico. And
Wow.
so, like removing yourself the from the daily grind, from your home, from the environment that is sort of holding the dysfunctionality can be really powerful.
Yeah. And how many, I'm curious to know. So prior to you and I co-hosting this, Peter and I did a few episodes with people from different backgrounds, different cultures, where their cultural imprint in primarily Southeast Asia, for instance, was really detrimental to how they experience sexual pleasure, in the
Mhm,
same way that we're discussing some of the religious aspects in America around
mhm,
primarily, I would suspect, white people that
mhm.
are in that purity culture that we've seen and we've heard about. How many of the people that you treat have that kind of cultural imprint? Or would you say that primarily the people that come to you are primarily white, fairly middle class people?
It's an excellent question. I would say that the vast majority of my clients are, well, that's not true. Okay. I'm hurt right now. I'm sitting here going through a mental Rolodex of all of my clients. Um, yeah, I have an array of people
Right. Okay.
who
Yeah.
come to me. But I will say this, Suzanne, that um, if I were to have somebody come to me whose culture this happened very recently, actually. Um, a Chinese man was coming because he's trying to work out his situation with his wife. And they share a very particular, they're both Chinese immigrants, and they share a very, very particular sort of familial and cultural history around
Yeah.
sexuality and relationship and intimacy. And I suggested that they see a Chinese therapist or
Yeah.
someone, I mean, it doesn't matter what they are, but someone who is really intimate with Chinese culture and
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
those messages, because I'm not the most powerful. I can help them with the somatic stuff, but all
Yeah.
that cultural influence, they would benefit from someone. And so that's what they did. They worked with a Chinese therapist, but then they came to me for sex coaching.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Because I
Uh,
think some of us come to these things with an unconscious bias. I know that in the other work that I do that's outside of this, I have to be very aware of how my background, my privilege, all of the stuff that I'm brought up with, how that informs how I think about things and how I approach certain topics. And, I know that my background is not everyone's background. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. You bring up such a good point. And I think that's kind of true with any work in any society, any system, right? You want to always be aware and conscious of your limitations. I wrote a whole, author statement in the beginning of my book
Mm.
about who I am, what demographic I am, what experience I have, what education I have, and so that you understand what what lens it is that I'm speaking about these things, through what
Yeah.
lens, you know? Um, and being aware, just, as human beings, we have a responsibility to be aware of our biases and our blind spots.
Yeah. So when going back to working with couples and you go off to lovely Cabo or wherever and you hang out with them, um, how familiar are these sessions? Like, are these people actually being
Having sex.
sexual in front of you, or are they going away and you're giving them instructions and then report back to me how it went? Like, you have to be prepared to be pretty vulnerable and exposed to discuss these topics, right? With somebody who's not your partner.
Yeah, namely me.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I mean, the biggest question that people ask me when I tell them what I do for a living, that inevitably, do you watch people have sex?
Yeah.
The answer is no, I do not.
Yeah.
I have done hands-on work, and I am willing to do hands-on work, but it brings the work and the sessions into a completely different category.
Yeah.
And it's not my preference. I do it when I feel safe enough to be involved on that level, and we have a deep understanding, and there's a deep level of safety already in the sort of clinical relationship. What my sessions look like, particularly like an intensive, is depending on the couple and depending on what they're dealing with. It's usually I'm like, this work can be so sort of enormous and sort of traverse lots of different areas. So there's a lot of relational work that involved that looks a lot like if you were going to a deep, sort of couples counselor session and really getting down to the nitty gritty of, what's actually happening between the two people.
Yeah.
It's very much like that. It's just that I include sexuality, whereas most therapists don't. They're not trained to, and it's siloed into this sort of separate area. So when I come to a couple, and I work with a lot of couples that are like at the edge of divorce.
Yeah.
They just can't, they're not meeting each other's needs. They can't understand how they can meet each other's needs. They don't even understand exactly the nature of the needs. So we sort of break it all down to the core level of and undoubtedly like family of origin, family constellation work, childhood trauma, core wounds, attachment wounds, all those kinds of things all come in to play. But what the beauty of having an intensive does is that you can dive into this work without having to close a Zoom window after 50 minutes, 60 minutes, and then go about your day and show up to your 3:00 meeting at work, right?
Right.
Like, we can just go all the way and then, take breaks and recover and fill up and nourish. And I can sort of guide and curate their exposure to each other throughout this process. And so, yes, often I will send them back, if it's a particular like sexual issue, I'll send them back to do an exercise, and come back for our afternoon session, and we'll sort of debrief and see what happened in there.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds hardcore, to be honest.
It is.
And kind of scary in a way. And I suspect that, you really have to be committed to your relationship to want to go into this. Because, as we know, and I know personally, it's if you've never spoken about sex with your partner before and you're like, look, we just have to deal with this and let's just go and see somebody and deal with this and then go into it can, it's like you said, it's deep work. It's often, I suspect, really can be quite revealing I know some of the conversations I've had when I've been in long-term relationships and haven't asked the questions at the onset and then asked them later. I was like, oh shit. So that's who you are. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Those
Yeah.
past 4 years that we've been together, or 10 or whatever, it's can be a real shock to
Yeah.
to find these things out, right? About the other person.
Yeah. Suzanne, I think the best thing that I do, the most, that my favorite part of what I get to do with people is, particularly couples, but in general, like, is validate their experience
Mm,
and to create a safe space to have these conversations and to talk about the things that you were conditioned to believe that you should never talk about,
yeah,
that are
exactly.
now causing pain and suffering in your life on some level, either very overtly or that sort of, that sort of persistent underlying ennui and malaise.
Yeah,
Um, I, uh, I think that it is deep work, and you can take it as far as you want to take it. You can come to me and have, like, look, we have different desire levels. My wife wants to have sex all the time, and I'm just not that into it.
mm,
And how do we meet in the middle? That's not that deep, you know.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
we could take it down to the core level, but we don't have to. We can sort of coach it from the behavioral aspect.
Yeah.
Um, if that isn't solving the problem, and it does solve the problem, it's like, okay, you're thinking about this the wrong way. Let's break this down into the three kinds of intimacy, the three levels of intimacy, and let's make a tactical plan for managing your sex life in the context of your busy lives in other areas. Easy, right? Um, the the I think that when we talk about, sort of how to use a sex coach, how to improve our sex lives, because we've never paid attention to this,
Mm,
there's a huge range,
yeah.
and some of it gets very much like therapy, and sometimes it's just really like better planning, better communication. Everybody needs better communication about anything in their lives, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, I've just had my friend stay with me for 3 weeks in the Grand Canaries, who was my partner for a number of years, and now he's my best friend. And I am more open and honest with him now when there's no risk attached. Well, I don't see any risk attached to being totally transparent about all the things I get up to or want to get up to, and just all the stuff that I enjoy, right? And he doesn't. And whereas in our earlier part of our relationship, he I found him to be very judgmental about some of the earlier choices that I'd made about my sex life. Now he's not judgmental at all. He's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
whatever you want to do, you go off and do. Like, doesn't it affect me. We're just mates now. So, and I would have liked to have gotten to that point in our relationship when we were intimate, but I just found that the reaction that I got was so overwhelmingly like you're about, kind of quite negative,
Judgmental.
that I just kind of took it out. And I've done that in multiple relationships when my previous behavior or something that I want to do just doesn't gel very well. It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, I'll just remove this from our relationship. I That's just a side note. What one thing I did want to ask, because I know that you've spoken about it a couple of times and just in passing, was the fact that you've dealt quite often with people who have had serious porn addiction. And I get loads of inquiries on TikTok and really sad messages from people whose partners, who are primarily men with penises, um, are addicted to porn.
Yeah.
And So when you're working with these people, is it typically because they're in a relationship and it's come up and they've decided they're going to do something about it, or because it's starting to do you see any patterns of the people that struggle with this, and when and why they come to you?
Yeah, there are two in specifically to porn addiction.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are two scenarios, generally two buckets that people who are dealing with that fall into. One is that I get a lot of people who come to me with erectile dysfunction or intimacy issues, or not being able to eat, like it's their partnered sex is not working.
Right. Yeah.
And it's I can often sort of spidey sense it out that there's something going on there in terms of porn use.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I help people understand that they actually do have a porn addiction. I am not qualified to diagnose addiction,
Right.
but certainly compulsive behavior I can name and point to, and help somebody, get properly resourced in understanding and owning and making changes, healing from that. So like the function, sometimes they come in with like dysfunction in the relationship or in themselves.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, and I sort of drill it down and recognize compulsive porn use as a contributing factor.
Right.
But there are a number of people who come to me. I had a discovery session yesterday with someone who is very well aware of his porn addiction and really struggling to stay sober and struggling to replace his very troubling fantasies and what will allow him to have an orgasm and sort of have a sexual experience. He really wants to change that. He's really troubled by that, and it's really, it's very, my heart goes out to people who are dealing with that and can't seem to sort of resist or turn the tide. So there's
Yeah.
that, people who come to me and say, I want to stop watching porn and I'm having a very hard time doing it. I
Yeah.
gotcha.
Yeah. I can appreciate that. And I think, it's from the messages that I get, it's clearly impacting a lot of people's relationships. And also there seems to be a degree of defensiveness around, oh, that's not it.
Yeah.
When couples talk about it in the messages, it's like, he doesn't want to acknowledge it. I've confronted him about it. He says it's nothing to do with that. And, and so it goes. So
There's a lot of, look, Suzanne, there's a lot of shame around pornography. There's a lot of shame around sex of all kinds. And there's a lot of shame around pornography. And also, as we live in a culture and a system that basically excuses boys will be boys, men will be men. Men have penises, we're going to watch porn. And there are a lot of men who don't watch porn. And I'm not even vilifying. I'm a huge champion of exhibitionism and voyeurism, and all of that is can be extremely healthy if it's not compulsive. And it's all consensual. It's an enormous healthy part of sexual expression. But there are issues with porn, and maybe we need to talk a little bit more about that separately.
Yeah. Look, all of this boils down to, as you said before, we've said it often enough, you can do whatever you want, provided people don't get hurt, and provided it doesn't stop you from living a fulfilling life and being happy, right? Once it becomes something that becomes absolutely necessary for you to, have an orgasm or or just just have some degree of sexual pleasure, and you can't get along without it, then it becomes problematic. And I've engaged with numerous people whose fantasies were so obscure and weird and bizarre. I thought, how are you ever going to find somebody that is going to do this for you? And when that happens, I think it is important to try and recognize that it's not healthy and to seek help. I mean, unfortunately, the bottom line is that people like yourself are operate outside of public health systems. So we can't just choose when we're experiencing these problems to just go to the National Health Service, I suspect, and just say, hey, can you put me in touch with a sexologist? Because I need some support around this, right?
Yeah.
It's there's a lot of shit that gets told to menopausal women about lack of desire just being perfectly normal for women of our age, and therefore just deal with it, right? So there's a lot of challenges around that, and there's not enough just general information that people like yourself exist, do this work, and are accessible to, I suppose, people that can afford it, which is the bottom line, really. It's
yeah. I mean, mental health mental health and wellness and all of that is, we don't, as culturally as a system, we don't really value that and provide resources for that in the way that we do if you have tonsillitis.
Yeah.
I think that what you're saying is, yes, it's so true. And it's, I'm often saying, look, we put money into and allocate resources for physical fitness, for dental health, for financial stability and growth and wealth, for we cultivate all of these things in our lives for travel, but nobody ever tells us that we need to sort of invest in and allocate resources to our sexual well-being. And actually what we're sort of conditioned to believe is that sex just takes care of itself. You don't need to talk about it. You don't need to deal with it, whatever. It's just that other thing. Let it lie. And that's exactly not right.
No, I mean, I'm assuming because you're in America, you're not in plan of any insurance company. No.
I am not in plan of any insurance company. And not only that, Suzanne, but I can't advertise on social media because it's banned. Because anything sexual wellness and sexual health
is
not, it's in the same category as pornography. So there you go.
It's ridiculous. The whole thing is just insanely insane.
Yeah.
It's nuts. It's nuts. True. But it's the same with it's the same with sex tech. It's the same with anything primarily, but not exclusively to do with female sexual health. Primarily. But male sexual, but when it comes to your job, it also includes male sexual health. So the whole thing is crazy. But there you go. Anyway, now we know what you do. I'm so grateful because I've been talking to you for months and I didn't know what you did. So.
Well, thank you.
If you are listening to this and thinking I could use some of that magic stuff that Zoe prescribes, then go and check her out. And the link is in the bio. And we're going to, and coming up this year, we've got some big plans to do some stuff together around some activities and things that are specifically aimed at couples and creating better intimacy in couples. I think that's one of the things that we've talked about. So stay in touch. Yeah. Have a lovely day, Zoe.
Yes. Thank you, Suzanne. You too.